The mountain cabin has always been a refuge for Emma and her friends. Situated on a secluded mountaintop, surrounded by dense forest and covered in snow most of the year, it was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and reconnect with nature. However, what began as a peaceful retreat would soon turn into a terrifying experience that would haunt everyone involved. It was a Friday afternoon when Emma received an envelope sealed with black wax and strange stamps. The letter inside contained just a few words: "Come to the mountain cabin. Something is waiting." Emma read and reread the message, intrigued and apprehensive. Who would have sent such a mysterious invitation? And what did "something is waiting" mean? Emma's curiosity quickly overcame any concern. She knew her friends, Mark, Sarah, and Jake, would also love an unexpected adventure. She called each of them, sharing the news and suggesting they meet at the cabin that very night. When the group gathered in the city and headed towards the mountain, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The winding road that led them to the cabin was empty, only the evening light illuminating the snowy landscape. With each turn, the feeling of isolation increased, and the surrounding pine trees cast menacing shadows. Finally, they saw the cabin at the top of the mountain, secluded and welcoming. The first impression was that everything was in order, as always. The cabin seemed to be waiting for its visitors, and a fireplace roared in the living room. A sense of mystery was in the air, but friends believed it was just the excitement of the moment. The cabin was simple, with a cozy living room, upstairs bedrooms, and a well-equipped kitchen. As Mark and Jake brought their luggage inside, Emma and Sarah lit the candles, filling the room with a soft, welcoming light. However, as the night progressed, an eerie atmosphere began to take hold. The whispers from the forest outside seemed to grow louder and more persistent. They were unintelligible whispers, as if distant voices were trying to communicate. The friends looked at each other, unsure of the source of the disturbing sounds. As dinner was served and they tried to relax, the whispers persisted. Mark suggested it was just nocturnal animals in the forest, but Emma's restless eyes showed she wasn't convinced. As they shared stories and laughter in front of the fireplace, the whispers continued to echo, creating a sense of unrest. When they finally decided to settle down for the night, the sounds seemed to follow their friends into the bedroom. In the darkness of the room, Emma struggled to find sleep. The whispers, increasingly disturbing, seemed to penetrate the cabin walls. She couldn't help but feel that something was wrong, that the mysterious invitation had led them to a place they shouldn't be. While her friends slept beside her, Emma remained awake, watching the darkness that enveloped the cabin. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting in the forest outside. His thoughts turned to the letter with the cryptic message, "Something is waiting." She was about to find out what this meant, and fear began to creep into her heart. That night, the whispers in the forest didn't stop. Emma spent hours awake, sitting in the darkness, watching through the window as darkness enveloped the cabin. The whispers, like distant and distorted voices, seemed to be getting closer and closer, as if they were approaching the cabin. Finally, tiredness won and Emma managed to doze off for a brief period. When he woke up, his friends were still sleeping, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. A feeling of fear consumed her. She felt that something was wrong, that something sinister was approaching. What made her even more apprehensive was the fact that the cabin's front door was ajar. Heart-pounding, she stood up and approached the door, hesitating for a moment before finally closing it. Outside, the forest was silent except for the whispers that still filled the air. Emma made sure the windows were locked and went back to bed, but the fear persisted. The whispers outside continued, as if the voices were trying to communicate. She looked at her friends, sleeping obliviously, and wondered if they could hear the whispers too. At dawn, she woke Mark, Sarah, and Jake and shared what had happened during the night. Mark and Sarah, still skeptical, suggested that she was just letting her imagination run wild. However, Jake, who was more sensitive to the energies around him, agreed that something was wrong. He felt the dark presence that hovered over the cabin. They decided to investigate the cabin's surroundings in daylight, hoping to find a rational explanation for the strange events. As they explored, they found a snow-covered trail that led them deeper into the forest. The whispers were still audible, as if they were guiding them. The trail led them to a hidden clearing in the forest. In the center of the clearing, a circle of dark stones was arranged, forming a mysterious pattern. His friends stopped to examine him, curious and apprehensive. The whispers seemed to get louder in that place. In the center of the circle of stones, they found an ancient tree, now dead, with strange carvings and sinister symbols. Jake, with limited knowledge of the occult, recognized the symbols as part of an ancient ritual used to summon supernatural entities. This further increased the feeling that something very disturbing was happening on that mountain. As they examined the tree, an icy wind burst into the clearing, making their friends shiver. The ominous presence in that area seemed to grow stronger. The shadows of the forest began to twist and move in an unsettling manner. Startled and aware that something was wrong, Mark, Sarah, Emma, and Jake quickly retreated from the clearing and returned to the cabin, where they tried to calm down. The discoveries in the clearing were disturbing, and they found themselves confronted with something that was beyond any rational explanation. Whatever was happening on that mountain, they were determined to discover the truth and, if possible, put an end to the nightmare unfolding around them. They had no idea how much worse the situation would get before they could find answers. The atmosphere in the cabin became increasingly tense as night approached. The friends tried to keep their spirits up, but the ominous presence and mysterious whispers were beginning to affect them deeply. Emma felt they needed to understand what was happening on that mountain. She shared her suspicion that the dead tree and ominous symbols were somehow linked to the disturbing whispers. Jake, who had limited knowledge of the occult, began researching the symbols and rituals in his books and on the internet, looking for some explanation for what they were experiencing. Time passed as they discussed what to do next. The nighttime whispers outside the cabin continued, becoming almost deafening. They could no longer ignore the feeling that something sinister was happening on the mountain. Finally, Mark, determined to act, suggested they go out to confront whatever was out there. He argued that perhaps, by facing the unknown, they could dispel the fear that was consuming them. The others reluctantly agreed, and Emma grabbed a flashlight to light the way. The moment he opened the door, a gust of icy wind rushed into the cabin, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Sarah screamed, and Jake turned on the flashlight. When the light illuminated the room, they saw that Mark was no longer there. His sudden disappearance left his friends in a state of shock. Panic took over them, and they ran out the door, calling Mark's name in the darkness. But he had disappeared without a trace, as if the mountain had swallowed him. A feeling of helplessness enveloped them as the forest outside seemed to devour any sound they made. Determined to find him, Sarah and Jake continued their search in the dark forest. The disturbing whispers still filled the air as if the voices were mocking them. They finally reached the clearing with the circle of stones, where they found Mark. He was standing in the center of the clearing, staring at the dead tree and the ominous symbols carved into it. His gaze was empty, as if something had possessed him. When Sarah called his name, he didn't respond, continuing to stare at the tree without blinking. Jake, terrified, tried to touch him and call him back to reality, but Mark remained unshakable, as if catatonic. The icy wind began to pick up again, and the shadows of the forest seemed to twist, approaching the clearing. Sarah and Jake realized they were in danger. Mark, possessed by some sinister force, posed a threat. They knew they needed to find a way to save their friend and escape that cursed mountain before it was too late. Jake decided to turn to his knowledge of the occult. He began reciting the words of a protection spell he had found in his research. Sarah, determined to bring Mark back, held his hand and closed her eyes, focusing on her friend and hoping to bring him back to reality. As the spell was cast, the dead tree in the clearing shook, and the whispers seemed to grow even more distressing. The sinister presence, once unshakable, began to weaken. Mark slowly began to regain consciousness, his eyes returning to normal. The trees stopped shaking, the whispers subsided, and the evil presence retreated. A sense of relief washed over Sarah and Jake, who had finally brought Mark back from the dark abyss that had engulfed him. They ran back to the cabin, where Jake's spell and Sarah's determination had saved the day. Mark, visibly shaken and with no memory of what had happened in the clearing, was back to reality. They hugged each other in relief, aware that they had faced something supernatural and evil. The situation was still far from being resolved, and the mystery of the mountain only deepened, but at least they were all together and safe for now. The story of that night became a scary story that they shared with others, warning of the dangers of exploring unknown places and the secrets that may be hidden deep in the mountains. As they tried to understand what they had faced, the mountain remained an enigma, guarding its otherworldly secrets in the dark of night. The night in the mountain cabin had left deep scars on the friends. Mark, Sarah, Emma, and Jake spent the next few days discussing what they had faced and trying to find explanations for the terrifying events that occurred in that isolated place. Mark, still shaken by what had happened in the clearing, could not forget the feeling of being possessed. He worried that something sinister had attached itself to him, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His friends tried to reassure him, but the shadow of that night would never leave them completely. Jake continued his research into the sinister symbols and ritual they found in the clearing. He discovered that the ritual was related to ancient cults that sought to summon supernatural entities. However, information on how to break this type of bond was scarce and unclear. Sarah, meanwhile, could not forget the whispers that had permeated the night on the mountain. She was convinced that the voices they heard in the forest were trying to tell them something, perhaps a warning or a dark secret. She spent hours researching ancient local legends and stories of supernatural encounters in the region. As the mystery deepened, they decided to return to the clearing to get more answers. Carrying a camera and voice recorder with them, they hoped to document any supernatural activity they might encounter. Upon arriving at the clearing, the feeling of fear immediately returned. The sinister symbols on the dead tree were still there, like marks of an ancient and evil presence. As Jake took notes and Sarah took photos, they felt the temperature drop quickly. The whispers began once again, but this time they seemed clearer. Sarah brought the voice recorder closer and recorded the mysterious whispers. The voices seemed to ask for help, begging for something that their friends couldn't understand. It was as if the voices belonged to souls trapped in that place. When they analyzed the recordings later, the voices appeared to form a pattern of words and phrases, but they were still difficult to decipher. They knew they were facing something supernatural and decided to seek help from a paranormal expert. While they waited for the expert to arrive, the atmosphere in the cabin continued to be haunted by the events on the mountain. They felt like something was lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. The fear was always present, a ghostly presence that they could not ignore. The paranormal expert arrived at the mountain cabin and began investigating the events that had occurred. He confirmed that the ominous symbols on the tree were related to ancient occult practices, and that the clearing was, in fact, a place with a dark history. While the specialist performed purification rituals and tried to communicate with the mysterious voices, the friends waited with expectation and anxiety. The cabin seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy, and they knew the answer was about to be revealed. During the communication, the specialist managed to establish a dialogue with the voices, and what he discovered shocked everyone. The voices were those of souls who had fallen victim to an ancient summoning ritual gone wrong. They were trapped in that place, unable to find peace. With the expert's help, they performed a ritual to free the souls trapped in the mountain. The clearing shook and the voices became louder and more distressing, but eventually the feeling of oppression disappeared. The grateful voices disappeared, and the mountain seemed to calm down. The mountain cabin, now free from the dark forces that tormented it, was abandoned by her friends. They decided it was time to move on and leave the past behind. The experience on that mountain would remain a horror story, a frightening reminder of how terrifying the unknown can be. And so, they left the cabin and the mountain behind, hoping that the mystery of the whispers and ominous symbols would never find them again. The journey on that mountain had left scars on their souls, but it had also taught them to never underestimate the power of the supernatural and the price of unbridled curiosity.